Today we're going to take a look at cheek filter gas masks, probably the most ill-conceived idea for a gas mask possible. Now, during World War II, Britain made a tank called the Coventer. The Coventer was such a bad example of a tank that it's actually used in engineering schools to teach people how to not build tanks. Essentially, it's so bad that you use it to say, if you do anything better than this tank, you've done a good job. So, the M17 series of gas masks and their spin-offs, or clones, copies, whatever, of cheek filter masks, I think are a good example of the gas mask equivalent of the Coventer tank. A mask idea that's so poorly conceived you can use it to teach people how not to design a gas mask. So that's what this video is about, how not to design a gas mask, and we're going to be looking at the M17 clones and copies that are so poorly conceived that they've just done everything wrong. Now, unfortunately, due to American export laws, I can't actually own, or legally own, an actual US M17. So what I have here is the Eastern European copies of them, and the only example being this American XM28, which I happen to have here. Now, these two on the end aren't too bad masks, but we'll get to these. But the US M17 was basically very similar to this Bulgarian mask. Rather than having an external filter canister on the mask, you had two pork chop style filters that went inside the mask here. The idea being that it, in theory, made the mask lighter, and it meant that there wasn't a filter to get in the way of a shooter. However, these design choices never actually had the intended use. This is the type of filter that was used in an M17 style gas mask. As you can see, this is why it's called the pork chop style filter. You had one in each cheek, air was inhaled through this section, and when it went into the mask it would come through this entire flat section here. The idea being that if you had two of these, they were very lightweight and easier to breathe through than the normal filter. However, you maybe start to realise problems when you realise the size of this. So what I'm going to do now is compare one of these filters to a real sort of 40mm filter, and you might get some idea of the problems that are going to start to emerge. So here we have a 40mm filter, here we have one of these pork chop filters. Now, if you consider the total area that's actually going to filter stuff, the 40mm filter clearly, despite being quite a lightweight small filter, can filter a lot more. You've got a particulate filter in the bottom and then activated charcoal in the top. So the problem being is that if one of these filters in heavy gas environments can expire within hours, how long is this little thing going to last? Not very long at all. Now, the other issue is, with a filter like this, you can easily keep it plugged, take the plugs off and install it onto the mask in easily less than a minute, and about 20 seconds if you've trained to do it. With a filter like this, they have to be inserted into the mask before you can actually use the mask. And that's a really stressful and very irritating process. So to keep these filters inside the masks, the actual section in the cheeks that hold the filters have to be smaller than these filters themselves. So you need to stretch the mask to hold the filter in place. That issue being, that means you have to stretch the rubber by quite a big extent to get these filters in. When I did it with the M10 yesterday, the rubber ripped because the mask's getting old and these filters are bigger than the slots they're designed to go into. The other important issue is, with a conventional mask, you can install the filter on the outside. So if the filter runs out while you're in combat or being gassed, you can simply take one filter off, hold your breath and install a new filter. Again, in only about 20 or 30 seconds if you've trained to do it. With something like this, you'd have to take the mask off, thus exposing yourself to gas to change it, and even then it wouldn't be a fast process. So in the event of a nerve gas attack, you'd simply be dead if you had a filter like this to use. Now, an argument I've heard made to defend these masks is that America didn't have a lightweight canister mask prior to these masks being put into service. And that's simply just wrong. What we have here is an American M9 respirator. And you'll notice the M9 takes a 60mm filter. So I'm just going to put that there a second. And then Britain, an ally of America, had the light anti-gas respirator, which, if I remove this 40mm plug, can take 60mm filters as well. So the Allied forces, prior to the invention of the M17, had masks that took 60mm filters, which are much more comparable with modern 40mm filters than the cheek filter masks. Now, to give you an example of just how easy it is to install a normal filter like this, you get the filter, take the cap off, put it onto the mask, screw it in clockwise, It's actually more difficult because I'm at an angle to it to try and get it on the camera. There we go, you'd pull that plug off, the filter's usable. That's an old asbestos filter, so I'm not actually going to use it. But the concept is very simple, and if you want to change the filter, the exact same process, unscrew it like that, you can put your new filter on. Again, if you're trained to do it, that will only take you 20 seconds or so. With a cheek filter mask, you simply cannot change the filter. And one of these filters will last much longer because the size of it compared to a cheek filter is pretty crazy. That's your cheek filter, that's your M9 style 60mm filter. So you have a filter that simply won't last as long, that you can't actually change inside the mask. Now, another issue. When a cheek filter is inside the mask, it's constantly being exposed to the air. This causes the filter to expire. A filter needs to be sealed like this to not expire. Because when filters expose to the air, there's always going to be sort of chemicals and various things, irritants that get into the filter and be absorbed by the activated charcoal. Over time, this means the activated charcoal has fully absorbed everything it can, and then more things can get through the filter. So when you have a mask like this and it's constantly exposed to the air, by the time you come to put it on, the filter might have totally failed, or it will only last several minutes against actual chemical weapons. Again, meaning that because you can't change the filter easily, the operator of the mask is dead. So, as mentioned, the absurdity of the situation was in the 1950s, America went away from a mask like the M9 that was totally practical for what they wanted, and rather than making a new canister mask, they went with the M17 design like this. However, they kept the M17 in service for around about 40 years. It was only after the first Gulf War that they decided they actually needed a 40mm mask. Everybody else in NATO by that point had either gone from 60 to 40mm or was in the process of it, but they all had masks that took filters like this, either in 60 or 40mm, that screwed onto a section of the mask and was fine. Now, in the Soviet Union, most of the masks were SHM41 type hood masks with 40mm GOST filters on. However, for some reason, other than the Soviet Union, a lot of the Warsaw Pact satellite countries, as you can see here, or decided to make clones of the M17, often into the 90s or mid-80s, where they clearly knew that these masks were no good, but for some reason they copied the design. What seems even more ludicrous to me was in Czechoslovakia, where the two M10 masks are from, they actually had 40mm filter masks in service prior to switching mostly to these, when they had far more practical, useful masks that were still in production, but the army was issued those. So here we have the XM28, which was meant to be America's successor to the M17. Now, as far as I'm aware, the XM28 only works against tear gas because they put a lighter weight filter in it. However, the XM28 is genuinely lightweight compared to an M17 type mask, so it did achieve what it was meant to be with lightweight. The problem with the M17s were, despite the cheek filters being lighter, the mask itself was so much heavier that when you had the weight of the filters and mask combined, they were still heavier than an M9 with its filter attached, so that totally defeated that purpose. The XM28, however, is very, very light. However, this was mostly just used by pilots and sort of riot police rather than actually being used for its intended purpose. The XM means it was a prototype and it never went into proper service. What we have on the right is the only actual pure Soviet cheek filter mask, the PBF, which takes EO19 filters. Now, this isn't as bad as the other masks simply for the fact that the filters this takes are actually more of an oval shape, as you can hopefully see from that. And the EO19 filters are fairly easy, I found at least, to fit into the mask. The rubber stretches well, and the filters go in. Because they're wider, as you can see there from the other cheek filters, they actually last a bit longer. And as far as I'm aware, these were mostly issued to riot police and things like that. It was never really intended to be a primary army combat mask, or at least never went past the prototype phase of being issued to the full-on sort of Soviet army. So, hopefully this has convinced some people that didn't know why cheek filter masks are such a bad idea, simply because you cannot simply change the filters and the filters run down very quickly in them. Again, they're fine against tear gas. If you use these as riot masks, they make a lot more sense. A lot of nations that use cheek filter masks ended up just issuing them to riot police anyway when they realised what a poor concept it was. As said, the XM28 and PBF on the right actually do serve some sort of purpose, but the fact that the US M17 was in service for about 40 years is astonishing considering how poorly conceived it was as a mask. The interesting thing with the US M17 as well is the M17A1 had a drinking tube and a resuscitation tube. The resuscitation tube supposedly broke the seal of the mask, meaning that if you tried to resuscitate somebody using it, you'd end up killing yourself from a chemical weapon anyway. Again, the M17 is sort of a load of failures in a row. It was, I guess, the idea just to make a lighter mask that you could shoot with easier, but it ended up being heavier, so awkward to put the filters in, and so impractical for defending the lives of the people using it as a gas mask that it couldn't do any of that. Again, I raise the point, what is the primary use of the gas mask? Keeping the wearer alive. Cheek filter masks are not good at that. And I still find it crazy that America had a mask like this in service prior to the invention of something like that, and then decided they wanted to move away from a lightweight canister filter mask to use cheek filters, and then 40 years later finally decide they were going to go back to a canister filter mask like all their NATO allies had been doing the entire time, because they realised it was a silly concept. Anyway, that's why I have such a hatred for cheek filter masks. I find them interesting to have as a collector, but from a design standpoint they are entirely stupid. It was one thing for America to prototype them and decide they were going to carry them on, but the thing I find even weirder was all the Warsaw Pact nations that decided 20-30 years after the M17 was conceived that they were going to make their own copies that were maybe even inferior to the American M17 itself. So, there you go. Cheek filters deserve to be in the dustbin of history, but hopefully this has explained to you a bit why, a mask like this is so poorly designed. I can't think of much these masks did right. As I said, they did better when they were recycled into riot policeman masks than they actually ever were as military masks. So there you go. If you're going to buy a mask as a survivalist, do not buy a cheek filter mask. The filters by this point are all expired because nobody makes them anymore. They protect you from tear gas and that's it. But you'll get so angry trying to fit the filters into the mask that you'll just get frustrated. Literally buy any other 40mm mask and use 40mm filters instead. You'll be glad you did.